Thank you very much, Mike Moffat, for coming back to the 905er. Always a pleasure to have you on to talk number one issue across the country, especially here in the 905, and that is housing affordability, and where are we going to put all the people. Mike, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
One of the reasons we thought it was overdue to have you back on was I saw your tweet the other day calling out Newmarket Council for basically saying a 9-story condo tower shouldn't go ahead because it might impact the drive-through times of a Tim Hortons that was down the road. And I thought that's just screams problematic. And then there was another article I saw right after I saw that one. In Oakville, the town council there basically sparked a letter kind of chastising them from the federal housing minister, threatening to withdraw their portion of the Housing Accelerator fund due to their pushback over the gentle density requirements in and around Sheridan College. Which sparked my question to you is, are we facing a 905 backlash against housing development and the current day?
Yeah, I think there's parts of the 905 that have been more challenging on this. So parts of York region, Oakville would be another, but it's not isolated to the 905. Like Windsor, Ontario, kind of famously said no to fourplexes and no to the housing accelerator. But yeah, it does seem that the communities that are pushing back the most on these changes are a lot of communities that grew in the late 90s and into the 2000s. So, Newmarket and Oakville are absolutely examples of that. So, progress is messy. It never kind of progresses in a straight line. And I expect to see more of this. That communities say, you know what, this simply isn't for us. My thing would be like, just say, okay, I at some level I do think cities should be able to plan how they grow, but what's the alternative, right? If a community said, well, no, instead of the 1,000 people going over here by the Tim Hortons, we think they should be over here, some other part of the community. Yeah, I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have it. But the alternative always seems to be just no, nothing here, and we're just gonna pretend that these people who need housing just simply don't exist.
Well, the last time we had you on, clearly somebody was listening to this podcast because you had mentioned how the federal government had all the money and they need to open up the coffers and start writing the checks and cutting the GST on new rental builds. Somebody clearly was listening because a few months later, the federal government kind of stepped up the game to meet the challenge. But I always figured this was going to happen. Even if the money starts flowing, we're getting that pushback. People saying, "Well, I don't want the strings attached to it, etc."
Right.
So, I guess my question now is like, what happens when that money, the big checks being written by the federal government to cities, aren't that much of an incentive anymore for the municipalities to essentially change their ways or their planning departments, processes, etc.?
Yeah, I think that is one of the big challenges here. That cities can do the cost benefits analysis, and some of them will decide simply that they can make more money some other way. So one example is the city of Ottawa. The city of Ottawa recently increased their development charges by about $7,000 to $8,000 a unit, which is going to make it very difficult for them to meet their housing accelerator targets. And as well, in the federal government's new infrastructure fund, there actually is a requirement not to increase development charges. And the argument the city made is say, well, we did the math and we would make more money by hiking development charges than we would from this infrastructure fund. So they're saying, look, if we lose this infrastructure money, that's not great, but that's just the cost of doing business. So I do think it is a challenge for the federal government that the amount of money that they're putting in these programs may not be enough to incentivize behavior. And the bean counters down at whether it be Ottawa City Hall or Oakville City Hall may just do the math and say, you know what, we're going to just keep doing what you're doing, and you can keep your cash.
And ultimately, if you're a councillor, or even a mayor, there's no amount of incentive that can come from another level of government that outweighs losing an election.
Yeah.
If you're going to lose, you care about the votes. You don't care about the money. And you know, I mean, no one's used the word yet, so I'm going to be the first. NIMBY. Let's just get it out in the open. This is another part of the never-ending kind of uh, NIMBY debate, which you know, it's it's a real problem because, yeah, obviously what we have here, if you're taking Oakville, and really, Rob Burton's made his career as mayor of Oakville out of opposing development, really. It's telling the residents of Oakville, you can have the town of Oakville, pretend it's not a city, and we can avoid the high rises. And now that we're saying even worse than high rises, that will have gentle density within middle class neighborhoods, that we can stop that too. But that's what his electorate is voting for. So that's democracy, right? I mean, how do we get around this issue that people, voters, do not like change? They're never gonna like change. I'm not sure that there's anywhere in the world where you'll find an electorate that really likes things changing. How do we incentivize people voting against their own interests? Because we have this kind of blame culture right now,
yeah. I would push back that on a little bit. Voters not wanting change. We've got an election in the UK right now, and I suspect some of those voters are wanting change. And actually, bring that up for a very good reason. Like if you look at the UK situation, there was some interesting polling that came out recently. That the one constituency that the Conservatives are the UK Tories are doing well with are homeowners who have fully paid off their mortgage. They're like, we're kind of fine with the status quo. Everybody else seems to be completely pissed off, whether it be homeowners who are still paying off a big mortgage, renters, people who would like to be homeowners, et cetera, et cetera. I think the challenge for municipal politics is channeling that, because in municipal politics in Ontario, the electorate is not a perfect representation of the general public. It is disproportionately older homeowners who vote. So I think that presents one of the challenges of how do you incentivize those people who are upset but traditionally don't participate in municipal elections. So, getting those people out to vote and so on. I also think there's a role, because we mentioned democracy, and absolutely we live in a democracy and we should live in a democracy. But I think one of the other big questions should be like which order of government should be responsible for these things. Because one way to get around this is to have the provincial government make those changes, and I think there's a very good argument to do so. Let's take the city of Brantford, which is about the fastest growing place in Canada right now. Well, why is it so fast growing? Well, in part, it's because cities like Oakville aren't building enough housing, so it's driving young families out to Brantford. So the decisions that an Oakville or a Newmarket or a Hamilton make affect Brantford, because Brantford can do all the right things on housing, but can never solve the housing affordability challenge because they're just going to cause more people moving in from Oakville. So, the question I have is what democratic rights do the people of Brantford have if basically their housing system is being decided by Toronto and Oakville? So I actually think there's room for the provincial government to set these rules, or else these smaller communities, basically have no control over their own destiny because they get so swamped by this migration from larger centers.
The argument you could make almost is that we already have a situation where there's no electoral peril for a councillor who votes, who always supports the most kind of small but vocal person who comes out and says, I don't want a 4-story fourplex next door to my house. Because even if that is gonna get And my argument would be, that's actually because the province already has a lot of power. Because the council says, yeah, oh, I'm completely on your side, Mr. Smith. Yes, it's an outrageous. It's completely not fitting for the local character of the neighborhood. Knowing full well, and we saw this in Oakville before the last election, knowing full well that the decision that they made would get immediately overturned by LPAT. So it's like his decision doesn't count. He knows that, but he can posture as someone on the side of the little guy. And it's like, if you actually give the city the decision, he or she is going to have to take the heat for that decision when it goes wrong. Whereas right now, they're in a situation where like I can be the biggest asshole and never pay the price. I mean, isn't that actually an argument for more local power rather than less?
Well, perhaps, and that does happen. And I know sort of municipal councilors who will recognize that some of their residents are being completely unreasonable, but also sort of recognize this, like, okay, well, I can block this thing, knowing that again it'll go to LPAT and get overturned, and I can make the province look like a bad guy, and we all end up paying for that because that delay, time is money, that delay, costs us all. I think the solution to that should be sort of an opportunity costing where the province comes in and say, okay, like, look, you've got a plan to build 25 or 50,000 houses. How you do that is entirely up to you. So then that counselor who wants to lop off 100 units from a high rise, that's fine. But those 100 units shouldn't go away at that point, right? They need to be added somewhere else, and that's what the system is currently lacking. That there's no sort of opportunity cost to opposing things. But I tend to believe more in local control, right? I think the best solution would be that we sort of decide, okay, what how fast is the population growing, how many more units do we need, and then the city can decide, okay, well, do we want to accommodate that through high rises, do we want to accommodate that through missing middle, do we want to accommodate that through expansion of urban growth boundaries, recognizing that that's going to increase infrastructure costs. But I think the conversation should be about how do we do this rather than going, okay, let's just block development and have those guys go down the 403 and go somewhere else.
But isn't it? And it begs the question. Sorry, Joel.
Sure.
I can't resist asking this question. There are other countries in the world that do things very differently. I'm thinking, like, if you go to London, England, you can see the different councils. You can see the exact style and decisions that an individual council has made writ on the horizon of the city. That Lambeth went this way and Chelsea went this way. But I guess that they had or have that ultimate kind of like, you've got to house this many people. There's no ifs, no buts. And exactly like you said, we don't care how you do it. You just have to do it. And that's what we have in this system. Technically the city has an obligation to house so many people, but actually how it all works out through the appeals process is this, the city is not really involved in a significant way in its decision. So it's a kind of a shell game, if you see what I mean. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think so. And that's the challenge with having the province, be the ultimate arbiter of this, that it gives cities out where they can oppose things that they really have no business opposing because they know that they can go to appeal. And that's, not just things around zoning. That's also things like development charges, right? Where they could throw everything in the kitchen sink on the development charges, knowing that, even if they're unreasonable about it, well, it can get opposed, it can go higher up the chain, but that has, that has a time cost. That's it's kind of a costly process. So yeah, having having that out at the provincial level does allow municipal politicians to basically play both sides of the issue, right? Where they can oppose things that they know they have no business opposing, and then just allow it to lose, and then tell their residents, sorry, I did what I can. If you're mad, go blame Premier Ford. Don't blame me.
Isn't that kind of what I guess the problem we have now? the last time we had you on, there was an emphasis on the feds need to kind of open the coffers and start putting money into this. And they seem to, albeit clunkily, and it's not a
Yeah.
smooth thing, but things never are in politics, but the money is flowing. Municipalities seem to want to develop, but again, there's an out so that they don't have to really be answerable to their constituents. It sounds to me as if the province is not really stepping up to owing its share of the housing pie, if you will. And I'm wondering, can you maybe just tell us how, as somebody who's looked at this in far more detail than us, how is Ontario and the 905 doing on getting the housing that's needed built, and what could they or should they be doing to expedite it on their end?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing housing starts fall in most of the countries, including Ontario. So, there are some country-wide issues, causing a decline. The obvious one just being the global interest rates, reducing demand for new housing and reducing the availability of capital to build new housing. Ontario, though, is doing particularly poorly. We're seeing these declines hit faster here. Partly that's because of what we build. That we build a lot of condos in Ontario, and that market is particularly interest rate sensitive. So that's declined right now. As far as what we should be doing, we have a playbook for it that the Ford government back in February 2022 came out with this affordability task force report, and we've only depending on who's doing the grading, we've only instituted about a quarter to a third of the recommendations. There's a lot more that we could and should be doing. I think in particular, looking at some of those costs around development charges, there are ways to get those down and still have the infrastructure we need to have great cities. But yeah, overall, the province had been, to their credit, fairly aggressive on housing reform in the first few years of the Ford mandate, going up to about, I think, mid 2022. But since then, everything's just ground to a halt, and there could be a variety of reasons why that might be. I think the Greenbelt scandal is a big reason for that. Coupled with some of the decisions around urban growth boundary changes to do them, then backtrack, and then in some cases backtrack on the backtracking. That the provincial government has gotten really risk averse when it comes to housing, and they've also got unusually deferential to municipalities. So, for instance, Bill 23 would have required municipalities to phase in development charge increases, and then in Bill 185, which should be law any day now, will reverse that, and now cities can institute development charges or the full amount of development charges right away. So yeah, it does seem that the province is particularly lagging, and that their appetite for reform has waned quite a bit. That they were aggressive a couple of years ago, not so much these days.
What would you like to see that the province do? Say, Mike Moffat is next premier of Ontario. What are you telling your Minister of Housing to do day one?
Day one. Okay. So I think the first thing is some of those changes that we've already seen in the Housing Accelerator, like those fourplexes as of right, having a density near transit lines and that kind of thing. The province can just do that. The federal government has to basically incent or bribe municipalities to do it. The provincial government can just do it at a stroke of a pen. So I think that would be the first thing. The second thing is I think there's a lot of building code changes we need. So we came up with the task force for more and better housing a few months ago that looked at these things. So really wonky rules like the number of staircases you need in a mid-rise apartment building, but it actually makes a big difference on the amount of housing we can build and that kind of thing. And then the third thing is finding a real reduction in development charges and other taxes like the land transfer tax. If you build in Ontario, according to a group called Cancia, the estimates they came up with, it's about 31% of the cost of new developments is a variety of taxes, which makes building, very prohibitive. So I would look at trying to find ways to get those development charges down, looking at ways to perhaps reduce land transfer taxes, particularly on more affordable housing. And there are ways to do that. So the task force report from the province talked about changing the way that we do water and wastewater infrastructure. There are ways that we can finance that that don't require large amounts being put on development charges. So it's a lot of really wonky stuff, unfortunately, and that's one of the big challenges with the housing file is there's no like one big, simple, easy to understand change that will fix this. It's a bunch of little things, but altogether, it adds up to something pretty big.
I mean, it's ultimately the kind of foundation stone of the Planning Act that's been in place for, I don't know when it was first passed, but a century ago, whatever.
Yep.
Is it a good foundation, or should is it a case where we'd almost be better kind of starting from scratch, saying let's look at how the rest of the world does this? Sure, North America zoning is a normal way of doing things. Official plans, all that kind of apparatus. These are fairly sort of typical ways of operating, but other parts of the world don't do this at all, and they seem to get by just fine.
Yeah.
Is there an argument that a brave party or potential future government say, let's just start over, redo the Planning Act from the beginning, and do something better?
Yeah, I do think there is an argument for that. I don't think it's necessary, but I do think there's merits to the idea. But absolutely, I think the way that we do planning here is, again, just completely backwards. One of the things that really drives me up the wall is that we allow municipalities to do their own population forecasts, their own housing demand forecasts, and things like that, which are really hard to do in isolation. Again, go back to my Brantford example. The biggest driver of housing need in Brantford is what happens in Halton and Toronto and so on. But there's no integrated approach. Like the population forecasts that we make for Brantford, they don't interact at all with population forecasts for other cities in the 905 or other cities in the GTA. So, there's no real sort of way to plan for that. I would love to see, and this was actually, again, one of the recommendations in the task force report, is that the province should be doing it. And the province should say, well, look, over the next 25 years, we're forecasting that your city is going to grow somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people. Make sure that your official plan can plan for that. But rather, what we have right now is the cities coming up with their own population forecasts. And if you've got a fairly NIMBY council, they go out and they find themselves a fairly NIMBY consultant to say, oh, look, your city's only going to grow by 12,000 people or whatever. So it's you have all these sort of composition effects, but also we need to tie it into policies like immigration. We need to tie it into international student growth and so on. Like a lot of our housing mess in Ontario is the fact that we didn't plan for international student growth. We just the provincial government gave free rein to the colleges, mostly colleges, but colleges and universities across Ontario to increase enrollment as much as they wanted without having any kind of housing plan whatsoever. And the federal government encouraged this as well through a variety of policies. And it was just that lack of integration. If we had done proper planning and said, okay, Conestoga College is going to grow by so many people, so let's incorporate that into our official plan, make sure we have enough student housing, the whole system would work. But we make all of these decisions in silos and at different geographic levels. So the parts don't equal the whole, and it's gotten us to the crisis we find ourselves in today.
Well, on that note, everybody's talking about housing being the driving cost of the affordability matter that we're all in. I find anecdotally more and more the people are saying the solution is cutting immigration. We need to kick these people out and limit the number of people coming in, and that's going to solve the housing crisis. And I'm just wondering, is this honestly a realistic long-term solution to the problem that we're currently in? Because I'm also thinking, well, the boomers are going to be retiring or dying very soon, and we don't have that human capital for the economy. So how do we square that?
Yeah, exactly. That there's a challenge here that, you may end up solving one problem and creating another. And I would argue that we kind of did that with the international student side, where we had a problem that our colleges and universities were underfunded. So it says, okay, instead of giving these institutions more money, just let them bring in as many international students as they want. And that worked for the sense that the balance sheets of colleges got really good, but it helped trigger a housing crisis. So it is that lack of an interaction that I do think, on the immigration side, like we have to kind of divide out two things. So one is the sort of permanent residency, what we traditionally think of as immigration. That has a cap. I mean, it's always had a cap. Now that cap has increased over time, and I do think it used to be 250,000 people a year across Canada. It's now 500,000. I don't think there's anything particularly magic about either of those numbers, right? So I do think the federal government should do more long-term planning, going, okay, this is what our labor market needs are roughly over the next decade. This is what we believe our infrastructure can support, and not just housing, but schools, hospitals, all of that, and come up with a long-term plan. Whereas right now they don't do that. But the big one is, again, on the non-permanent resident side, which is international students, temporary foreign workers. Traditionally, there's been no cap, no target on these whatsoever. And that's where the large problems have lied. And in fact, the federal government has really reversed course on that. So put it in perspective that we have about 2.5 million non-permanent residents across Canada, and over half of those are in Ontario, almost all in Southern Ontario. It used to just about a year ago, or 2 years ago, it was less than half of that. About 20 years ago, it was about 250,000, and that was never planned. That was never, we never made sure that we had the infrastructure for that. The federal government has, for the first time ever, started to set a target for that. And the target would essentially decrease those numbers by 200,000 a year. So, go from about 2.5 million to 2.3 million instead of growing. So I think there's fair questions to be asked about whether or not they'll actually be able to accomplish that. But if they are able to hit those targets, I think that's actually going to be a very transformative change, particularly in Brampton, but across the 905, where instead of adding hundreds of thousands of international students every year, we're actually going to see the numbers decrease in absolute terms. So that delta is absolutely massive. But again, I think there's fair questions about whether or not governments are actually going to be able to hit those targets.
Just for the sake of our listeners, well, for my sake too, to be honest, who probably a matter of months ago wouldn't have really realized that this was a thing. If you think about immigration and population growth, you think permanent immigration and people having children. And then we're, basically has emerged almost, it seems, over the last few months. Like, well, actually, the sort of temporary residents, students is a massive problem. What kind of numbers are we? Well, I mean, you mentioned 2.5 million, obviously, but
yeah,
I mean, how much of a change does that make? Say you get rid of that number overnight, and that sector doesn't exist anymore. How much of a change in kind of percentage terms does that make to a city like Brampton?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely massive. So to Brampton, for instance, Brampton's population just from international students alone last year grew by 4.4%. So basically imagine it's Canada Day 2022, and you have 100 people, you added 4 to 5 people to that population who are just international students. That doesn't count immigration, doesn't count anything else, just international students. So in a lot of areas of the 905 and other college towns like Kitchener-Waterloo, London, Windsor, it's the fastest growing segment of the population. And what essentially happened was that over the last 15 to 20 years, the immigration system has essentially absorbed the higher education system. And there were actually really good reasons to do this. So if we go back to about 2008 or so, the Harper government decided that it would be helpful in the immigration system to help get newcomers to Canada who had Canadian experience. And this is a classic Canadian problem, right? Where we have newcomers to Canada, they have a medical degree from a school in Afghanistan or wherever. They come to Canada and they end up, driving a taxi or owning a pizza because we don't recognize their credentials. We've tried so many different things to solve that problem. So back in 2007, 2008 or so, federal government said, well, hey, instead of bringing over 29-year-olds who get their credentials overseas, bring them over at 18 or 19, have them go to York or U of T or Conestoga or wherever, get their diploma or degree here, and then eventually allow them to apply for permanent residency. I think was the right thing to do. I think it was a really smart thing to do. But like so many things, it kind of evolved over time, and it kind of grew out of control, where internationally it was kind of seen as, well, if you want to immigrate to Canada, this is the fastest, cheapest, easiest way to do it. Particularly, again, more so at the college level than the university level. So that's where a lot of our growth comes from. And it's not, typically speaking, I think most Canadians think, when they think of international students, they think of, somebody, maybe an exchange student going to U of T, or a grad student, studying biology at Western. But in reality, most of who were coming in were students studying at a college, and it was usually something like fundamentals of business, fundamentals of tourism, where it wouldn't actually, to them, really matter too much of what they were studying. It was a sort of pathway into Canada. So we need to bring some rationalization into this, because unfortunately, like, the biggest victims of all this are actually the international students themselves, right? Because they come to Canada, they pay a lot of money to be here. They pay $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 to the schools to be here, and they get a terrible experience. They live in substandard housing. So the system had just kind of grown out of control. And the federal government and some of the provinces as well, looking to bring some rationality into this. And, hopefully we can get a system that works for everyone, because it's not working for existing residents, and it's certainly not working for the students themselves.
Speaking, bring it back to the provincial housing file directly. I'm wondering, in Canada, is there a province that is doing it right, that seems to be getting their act together and putting the right policies in place, the right measures in place, and just tend to be doing the right things to solve the problem, that could basically a role model for the rest of Canada?
Yeah, so I think there are lessons that we can learn from a variety of provinces. I think right now, I think there are two that are doing better than others. The first is British Columbia. The government there has gotten very aggressive on zoning changes. That is really the province leading the way. Just like I mentioned earlier, where having the province come in and kind of dictate these standards. I think that's been helpful. I don't think they've done enough on some of the development charge pieces, the tax pieces, that kind of thing. But yeah, they've done quite a bit there. The other one I would say is Nova Scotia. So we're looking at an NDP government in BC, a Conservative government in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, again, doing more on some of these regulatory changes. They've been a little bit better, I'd say, on the tax side, just because during the pandemic and afterwards, they had a big influx of Ontarians move there, both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. dealing with massive numbers of people who've been priced out of the GTA and go, oh, actually Halifax looks really nice and fairly inexpensive. So, they've been doing a lot of great work out there. But yeah, I think there's lessons we can learn. Like Quebec is really good at building, affordable rental, missing middle pieces. Alberta's been doing some things on zoning reform, more on like lower density. So I think there are pockets across the country, lessons we can learn. But yeah, if I look at who's doing the best on housing right now, I'd say British Columbia and Nova Scotia.
I mean, it's kind of related to that. I mean, looking worldwide, you probably are much more familiar than any, most of us, any of us, with how other places in the world do this. And certainly, I mean, I'm aware that other countries do it very, very differently. Is there any sort of country in the world that you look at and go, well, these guys have got it right? Both in terms of getting the right kind of development, but also in the way that the public is allowed to be part of it without necessarily stopping things that have to happen.
Yeah, so I would actually say parts of the United States, and again, I'll kind of use examples on kind of both sides of the political spectrum. I think both Minneapolis and Austin, Texas, have done a lot on the regulatory side, allowing for, again, gentle density, allowing for different types of forms. Portland is doing a lot on eliminating parking minimums, allowing for these kind of single egress apartments that I mentioned earlier. So that's basically apartments with a single stairway, which it just allows for more building forms. You'll note, if again, those three examples I use, Portland, Minneapolis, and Austin, they really have one thing in common, and it's disproportionately young populations, and I think that really does make a difference. So having these cities that are young, that are seeing these YIMBY movements on both sides. Again, sometimes it's coming from the more progressive side of the aisle, sometimes it's coming from more conservative folks, but they've been able to come together and create this coalition of the willing that's gotten reforms done. So I wouldn't suggest the entire United States is a model that we should follow, but I do think that there are these best practices in the U.S. That we can look at. And in general, housing in these markets is more affordable, particularly as a percentage of income. Your dollar goes a lot farther in an Austin or a Minneapolis than it does in a Toronto or Vancouver.
It just, as you're talking, it just sounds more and more here, this side of the border, we need kind of like just strong leadership. We don't have somebody just kind of stepping up to, take the bull by the horns, wrestle to the ground and say, no, this is what needs to be done, people, in the long term. Is that just what we need here in Canada? It's just kind of, instead of this passing the buck, as Roland said, a shell game of just see who'll bear the consequence. We just have somebody who says, nope, I bear it all. I take the good and the bad with me. But, by Jove, we need to make this happen. Is that what we need here in Canada, whether it's at the federal level or at the provincial?
Yeah, I think so. And it may just be a new generation of leadership. We are seeing some mayors and some councils across Ontario do take that leadership. So I think of Cam Guthrie in Guelph, and who's in his 40s like me, so be happy to be called young. Josh Morgan, mayor of London, Ontario. Jonathan Scott, a councillor in Bradford, or I think it's Bradford. You are seeing this generation of kind of younger Gen X and millennial, and hopefully the Gen Zs come along as well. I do think that will help. There's, I'm an academic, and there's this kind of unfortunate quote in academia, but there's a certain amount of truth to it that science progresses one funeral at a time. I do think, not that I'm wishing ill will on any politician, but I do think that generational turnover at the municipal level or even at the provincial and federal level will help. I mean, I think the fact that Sean Fraser's younger than I am, and I hate him for it. But I do think one of the reasons why he's been as effective and as bold as he's been as a housing minister is the fact that he's a dad of young kids, and I don't know if a 65-year-old housing minister would be quite as bold on this. So I do think a lot of it is generational turnover, and I'm so happy when I see the folks at more neighbors in whether it be in Toronto or some of the other branches, where you've got these great young women, young men who are going out, who go to city council meetings and actually advocate for more housing. Every one of these planning meetings, somebody will come out and say, well, I have concerns about this 12-story building. I think it should only be 3 stories. And, these folks are going out like, oh, I have concerns about this 12-story building. It actually should be 19 stories.
To extend, even in Burlington, I was kind of involved back in when, Burlington was in the middle of its revolution, if you like. The sort of years leading up to Marianne Mead Ward becoming mayor. And there were many people. I almost used the Donald Trump quote: "There are good people on both sides." I think the thing was, I completely sympathize with people in Burlington who felt that the development that was happening was being done without any kind of community involvement, without and what they were getting wasn't very nice. And I kind of stand by that. What the development that's happening isn't very nice. It's bad development. It's unimaginative. It's kind of gross. It wasn't, a lot of people would express that in terms of things like height and traffic and things and wind and things like this. But I think what you're often dealing with is people who are just looking for something they just don't want that building. And then they look for something they can use when they go to a council to explain why they don't want it. And I feel that a better system would be able to bring in the people on both sides of that kind of debate and actually use that. At least they're goddamn passionate about the city, But it gets misdirected. It gets the entire municipal system. It seemed to me when I was more involved in it, seemed like a system to make everybody as angry as possible, as quickly as possible. When you basically had some smart people who ended up hating each other's guts because of the way that everything worked, and it was a real shame. And worst of all, but coming back to a point you made, is the extent to which all the political pressure on municipal government comes from the wealthiest homeowners by a massive proportion. Simply renters do not get involved. And they are therefore ignored. From a political perspective, they don't exist. I was advised when I ran, it's like, don't bother going to high rises because no one's voting. Most of them aren't even on the electoral register. And it was a real tragedy. I went and did those houses anyway, but I probably was wasting my time. That's probably why I'm sitting here now. But I feel better for having done it. How do we turn that around? It's like, how do you get more people to vote is one of those questions. Like we all know it's a problem, but no one has the answer. But is there anything that could get us out of this never-ending situation where basically the people with the most interest in the status quo have all the influence?
Yeah, it is a challenge. And my colleague, Jesse Helmer, here at the Institute is just finishing up his PhD thesis, which is exactly on that topic of the fact that renters vote far less often or far less frequently in municipal elections and what to do about it. So, I'd highly, if you ever get a chance, I would highly recommend talking to Jesse.
Jesse's been a guest, former
that's
deputy
right.
mayor of Windsor, not Windsor, London. Sorry,
London. Yes, yeah, and now. Now slums it with us here at the Institute, but we're very grateful to have him. No, it is a challenge, and I think I have a lot of sympathy. I do have a lot of sympathy for the argument that, look, we're building a bunch of just ugly, tiny, expensive shoebox condos. There's truth to that, but my suggestion would be, okay, well, let's not use that as a reason not to build, but let's look at the root causes of that and go, well, okay, how can we fix it? Is it the way that we do development charges? Is it the building code? Is it, the fact that, we only have so much land and you can't really develop anywhere else. So we're kind of, forcing a lot of development into a little area. Let's look at the root causes. But I do think that, again, that the province has to come in and find ways to have cities come up with official plans that understand those trade-offs and go, okay, if you don't want 100 units here, those 100 units have to go somewhere else. And then I think if you can come up with that system, then at that point, I actually think the community involvement is incredibly important. I do think there is a role for the city to, decide, or the residents of this city to decide, okay, do we want to be tall and sprawl, or do we want to have growth spread out more equally? Do we want our cities to be more walkable or bikeable? Those kinds of things I think are incredibly important. But yeah, the system that we have now, there's no cost to vetoing it. It doesn't mean that development goes somewhere else, and it does feel like it becomes unnecessarily adversarial, right? Where you have people who agree on like 95% of things, just beating the heck out of each other about the 5% they disagree on.
Yeah, and everybody, the public in particular, is being sold a lie. They're being sold a lie very often, that they're attending a council meeting that actually has the ability to make a decision. They may be making a decision, but that decision is one in a chain of decisions, and it's probably a preliminary one. And they're going along thinking, well, my councillor must listen to me. And it's like, well, this is a lie. This is not the way that it actually works. Everybody in this situation is being misused, really, and that's why ultimately I would rather not. NIMBY is such a sort of blunt instrument of a word, because it's like there's more to it than that. The reason why people turn out at council meetings, and that energy can be, if the minute you actually sit people down and get them to consider the full picture of a decision, like you say, if people aren't going to live here, where do you want to put them then? Then you start getting people making better suggestions, but that's not actually the question that they're ever asked. They're simply asked, do you like this building next to your building? And then that's, you're going to get a dumb response.
Well, exactly. Yeah. There's no opportunity cost to it. And you get people going, oh, well, we should just have fewer international students or things like that. It's like, okay, well, that's fine. But that's, if that's how you feel about things, then vote that way in a provincial or federal election. You can't, the students are already here. The newcomers are already here. You can't just wish them away by saying, okay, yeah, we shouldn't build this building. So yeah, I tend to agree that people are often, given a sort of false sense of what is and isn't possible, and then can become disillusioned where they say, well, I did all this input, I went to all these meetings, and what we said just didn't end up mattering in the end, because it often doesn't. That these meetings can often be for show, that the decision for one reason or another has to go a certain way. But you still have people out there, you still bring people in, you still allow them to have their piece. And then, when they keep losing over and over again, that breeds a certain level of resentment. And I think that's completely understandable.
Yeah. I think that's the note to wrap this up on. Thank you very much, Mike, for coming on once again. Probably have you on at some point in the future to talk, surprise, more about housing, because it ain't built yet. So
it ain't built. Yeah, it's a form of job security for me. I'm not going to run out of stuff to do anytime soon.
You're the safest job in Ontario, probably.
Yeah, I really do. Really do.
Oh, thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me.